something and they might give you something in return. No previous religious belief structure had a deity with power over existence itself, over life and death. You know, it's very interesting when you talk about the historical gods, you see a little g, all of them to a T could die. Meaning, they weren't responsible for their own existence. They were created beings in all of these old civilizations. They didn't have the power over whether they live or died. They didn't have the power over keeping themselves in existence. Think back to the burning bush when Moses asked God, "What is your name?" What did he say? "I am who I am," or "I will be who I will be." And it's an amazing metaphysical statement. What God is saying in that moment is, I give myself existence. It means God's not contingent upon anything else. He literally is existence itself. Jesus' resurrection affirms this claim. Think about that. This was a deity that could claim power over existence itself. This had never been heard about before. Civilizations before the resurrection had very unfavorable views of the afterlife, if any. You know, some people might think, well, this is, the resurrection is just wish fulfillment. Well, if it was wish fulfillment, if it was a psychological, facet of humanity, we'd see it all throughout humanity, right? The Mayan and the Aztec civilizations, what was their view of the afterlife? Very shadowy underworld that was horrible. It was better to be alive than dead. Same thing with the Romans and the Greeks. If you read the Iliad, which is basically a big religious treatise and pseudo-history on their part, you look at Achilles is speaking from the underworld, and he says, "All of us are shadows. It is better to be a living goat than a dead human." And the more and more you look at these societies and what they believed, I mean, even the Jews, read Ecclesiastes and some of the other books, yeah, you exist after death, but you're kind of in this shadowy grave, this twilight land. You're not a full being anymore. They had a lot of questions about it, but it was not looked upon as somewhere you want to be. You can go through Hinduism and some of the other religions. The afterlife was horrible. A few minor exceptions for maybe people that did great, amazing deeds, but the idea of the resurrection and what it implied really just blew a hole in all of these belief systems. It was revolutionary. And rightly so it should be. If God actually wanted to send a message to us, you would expect it to be this unique and this powerful. Those of you who know memes, this will speak to you. Those of you who don't speak in memes, right, Nick? They won't understand this, but that's okay. The demonstrative scope of the resurrection. What does the resurrection actually demonstrate to us? Okay, we know it's a historical fact. We know that it's a unique event. Well, the resurrection demonstrates that we will exist apart from our physical body, and that at some future time, our consciousness or spirit, the wording is kind of different here and there, but that's basically what it's speaking to, will be embodied again, maintaining our identity. This is kind of where the burial of Jesus is very important as part of the gospel, as Paul says. Because between the crucifixion and between the resurrection, Jesus was dead. He was a corpse. And we're all going to be corpses someday. But what does it say about Jesus during that time? He still existed. He was separated from his body, but he still existed. The letter of 1 Peter talks about this a little bit. Some of the other writings of Paul talk about this. That between his death and his resurrection, Jesus maintained his identity and his consciousness. But his human nature was still not embodied at that time. And, it's very interesting. We have what I call Tom and Jerry theology. You ever remember the cartoons Tom and Jerry? Jerry would hit Tom with a hammer, Tom dies. He goes straight up to heaven, right? And that's kind of the bad Western Christianity view of the afterlife, isn't it? That you die, and you're a spirit, and you get your wings, and you go up and you're in heaven. None of that's true. When you die, if I die tomorrow, my consciousness will separate from my corpse. I won't go to heaven. I will go to what's referred to as paradise, as Jesus told the thief on the cross. Heaven comes later. It drives me nuts when I hear somebody say, so-and-so went to heaven. I don't want to be a stick in the mud and be like, that's not true. Let's have a theological debate right now. But the point is, it is very important for you as a Christian to understand this. Because Paul would have said the same thing. No, you don't go to heaven. You go to paradise. You go to be with the Lord. But that state of affairs is not perfect. That's what the burial also tells us. It's incomplete. That's not the end game. That's not what the afterlife truly is. It's just a holding point. It's a waiting time. So remember that when you think of the burial of Jesus, it's teaching you something. The resurrection demonstrates that Jesus is who he says he is, God incarnate. Due to this, everything he spoke of before his resurrection is true. I don't know about you, but if somebody comes back from the grave, I'm probably going to listen to what he says. Right? That's what the apostles were thinking. They're like, okay, well, I guess we better take him serious now. When the resurrection appearances happened, look at how they all reacted. Everybody freaked out. Everybody was suddenly humbled. Everybody was suddenly like, uh-oh. Because they're thinking back to all the things he said, and he's like, wow, I guess he really meant it. That's what happens when you meet somebody who comes back from the dead. You start to put weight in what they had to say. And interestingly enough, this idea of the resurrection, it demonstrates also Jesus came back and rose from the dead physically. There was a sect that started in the 2nd century called Gnosticism. And what they believed was Jesus just spiritually resurrected. They started the whole belief that the physical's bad, the spirit good. Again, with the Tom and Jerry theology. But it's not. Jesus physically resurrected from the dead. Spirit and body and mind together is what we have to look forward to. The waiting place is very nice. I can't wait to get there. But as Paul says, I yearn to be clothed with the resurrection body. The resurrection, due to its demonstrative nature, forces us to make a decision. This is the great thing about it. You can't get away from it. I'm sorry. And actually, I was going to do a whole process, limited time. I can't get into it, but the psychological studies. Human beings, we have a mental life, and we have a volitional will, meaning we can make choices. It turns out people don't like the resurrection. Even Christians, all of us. Think about that for a second. What about the resurrection do we find offensive? Jesus is God. He is who he says he is. And what he said is true. So now I need to take account of myself and figure out how I'm going to respond to it. Human beings don't like it when they come up against God. That's what the resurrection forces us to come to terms with. Luckily, Jesus is very patient and kind, and he went to the cross for us. Luke 24, verse 9 through 12. When they came back from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to the others. It was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the others with them who told us to be apostles. But they did not believe the women, because the word seemed to them like nonsense. Peter, however, got up and ran to the tomb. Bending over, he saw the strips of linen lying by themselves. And he went away, wondering to himself what had happened. Can you imagine that? Put yourself in the feet of Peter. And I kind of just threw a picture of this, the Shroud of Turin. I'm not really interested in talking about that right now. But just to give you a visual image, when he saw strips of linen, it was this big long sheet about 12 feet long, about 3 feet wide. And you kind of, the body would be laid that way, and then it would fold at your feet and cover the top. That was off to the side. Imagine you stick your head in the tomb, and you see just this linen just cast aside. What do you do with that information? You hold it in your hands, and you're looking at it. And you can see the psychological state that he was in, wondering to himself what had happened. John, talking about the same account in chapter 20, he says, so Peter, the other disciple, that's him, he's the other disciple, he's referring to himself in the third person, started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. See that? He saw it, but he didn't want to go in. We have the same kind of psychological reaction when confronted with the resurrection. Then Simon Peter came along behind and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had arisen from the dead. Then the disciples went back to where they were staying. And then pictured there goes along with the shroud, but that's basically the burial cloth that goes over the head. So as you're taking down a crucified person from the cross, as they were taking Jesus down from the cross, it's about a pillowcase-shaped thing. Goes over the head immediately before you get wrapped in the big cloth. Why is that? Because when you've suffered a crucifixion and beating, there's mucus and blood and all kinds of visceral coming down from the face. So they put that right over the head pretty quick, and then they put the other cloth over it. The interesting part here, if you look what's in italics there, the cloth was still lying in its place except from the other linen. The Hebrew used there says it was folded. So what do you imply from that? Put yourself in the tomb when Christ was resurrected. He sits up. It's the first thing he does. Takes that off. What does he do with it? Folds it neatly and puts it to the side. Then he kind of just takes the rest of it off like blankets, kind of sets it aside. I just think that little historical detail is so amazing. That Jesus sat up in the tomb and folded neatly the bag over his head, because he knew Peter and John were going to see it. So this is to sum it all up for you, to leave you with something, with the resurrection, after this little discussion. Earlier in his ministry, when Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets." They were avoiding the question. Jesus said, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" There's very little that I'm certain of in life, but I am certain that when you die, you will be before God, you will be before Jesus, and he will ask you this question: who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of of the living God. Do you understand what that entails? It's the question you need to face every moment of your life. There is immense freedom. There is immense love. There is immense change that can happen when you answer that question. The peace that that question will bring you cannot be measured. If you do have any questions about the content that I've gone over, there's a lot I left out. If you're looking for sources, if you want to discuss anything I said, I'll make myself available. But I want you to ask yourself this question. Jesus is asking you, who do you say I am?
Okay, we're going to turn to 888. Thank you, Lord, for loving me, and thank you, Lord, for blessing me. Thank you, Lord, for making me whole and saving my soul. I want to thank you, Lord, for loving me. Thank you, Lord, for saving my soul. Let us all with one accord sing praises to Christ the Lord. Let us all unite in song to praise Him all day long. Thank you, Lord, for loving me. Thank you, Lord, for saving my soul. Please reveal your will for me so I can serve you for eternity. Use my life in every way. Take hold of it today. I want to thank you, Lord, for loving me. Thank you, Lord, for saving my soul. Our next song is going to be 898. It's going to be the song before us, the song before going into the Lord's Supper. So it's going to be 898. And if you all could stand. Unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul. Unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul. Oh my God, I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed. Let not my enemies triumph over me. Give them that way. All leave me ashamed.